Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. And this episode, we're going to talk about mineral rights news for April of 2024. And Justin, before we hit record, we were talking about the diversity of topics that are covered in the media this month, from wind energy and renewables was a big focus for various reasons, which we'll talk about, as well as the benefits and sort of the growth of oil and gas in the United States and how that's contributing to budgets of some of the major states here.
You said it, Matt. And sometimes we have some really slow news cycles when it comes to specifically oil and gas stories, but this is not one of them. Seems to be a lot in the media currently.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. And let's dive into this first one because I thought this was really interesting, especially with the recent movie covering this particular tribe. So do you want to talk about this first story here?
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. They've definitely got some renewed press coverage here. So the article says tribal sovereignty trumps wind in Oklahoma. The article goes on to say, after a court sided with the Osage Nation to have an 84 turbine, 150 megawatt wind farm in Oklahoma removed for encroaching on its mineral rights, Italy-based Enel Energy is appealing the ruling with dismantling costs looming at $300 million. Representatives for the nation say that the lawsuit is about protecting their ability to develop precious minerals, hydrogen power, or carbon sequestration for future climate projects, reports Politico. And it goes on here with a quote that says, our effort not only will protect the production side, but we're looking at it, the protection of our reservation for future generations, said the Osage Minerals Council Chair, Everett Waller. This is really a huge effort. Offering further context, Politico explains that the Osage Nation recently gained wide recognition for the film Killers of the Flower Moon. The film, based on a nonfiction book, tells the story of dozens of murders of tribal members in the early 20th century by white men who wanted to take the tribe's oil rights. So, Matt, this movie has really kind of opened this up to the public, but it is an ongoing court case.
Yeah, it seems like there's ongoing battle that the tribe is trying to protect their interests. And, really interesting that they're protesting the wind farm, because I would assume that they would stand to receive royalties or some economic benefit from that wind farm. But, when you're sitting there and you have these 84 wind turbines making noise, it's a the visual aspect of it is a definite impact. And so, they need to fight for their rights, whatever they feel is right, whatever that is. Maybe in this case, they feel like removing those wind turbines and actually making sure that it's not going to block further development of their minerals is more of a benefit to the tribe. So very interesting battle. It's sort of like this renewables versus fossil fuels battle, and this is front and center here, and not for political reasons, more for protecting their rights and making sure that those benefits for future generations are protected. And so that's really interesting, and highly recommend the book, The Killers of the Flower Moon. It tells a shocking tale of those murders of those tribal members who weren't really given full custody of their minerals. They had to have a white person who was their custodian to get access to the money and to do all the things. And basically there were people that took advantage of that situation and stole from them. So yeah, very sad tale, but definitely something we need to recognize and to understand what happened there. And I haven't seen the movie yet, but when I have 3 hours to sit down and actually watch a movie, I'll definitely plan on watching it. So
you said it, Matt. And we talked about in episode 94 what leasing land for a solar farm is like. And it's interesting that they're bringing this up, and maybe it has something to do with the really long lease terms of solar contracts, or who knows. But it'll be interesting to see how this kind of shakes out, Matt.
Then, yeah, definitely check out that episode because it's pretty staggering, the amount of land that gets tied up with one wind turbine. And, I'm not sure how that would affect any oil and gas development around it, how much that would be blocked. It depends on the agreement, I assume. But, it's thousands of acres, I'm sure, with 84 turbines that are basically locked up into decades-long leases, and you really can't do anything else with that land during that time period. So, yeah, it makes sense why they're pushing back.
You said it, man. All right. So one of the biggest conferences just recently occurred, Matt, and to kind of set the stage for what this conference is, this is a place where all of the energy leaders, whether it's renewable, coal, they all kind of meet to talk about the climate and what it's going to be like. And obviously right now, renewables are a really important part of that conversation. And so this next article here, the title is Big Oil Sets the Agenda on CERAWeek's opening day. So CERAWeek 2024 will explore strategies for a multi-dimensional, multi-speed, and multi-fuel energy transition. The drive for energy transition is reshaping the competitive landscape for companies and countries, creating new opportunities and risks across the energy value chain.
So this conference was last week as of the time of this recording. So definitely interesting conversations that occurred. And Justin, like always, I feel like the Saudi Aramco CEO tells it like it is. So do you want to talk about what he had to say about the energy transition timetable?
Absolutely, Matt. So the Saudi Aramco CEO called for recognition that the demand for oil and gas is not going to be replaced soon and not by the 2030 target to limit global warming. He called the ambitious timetables put out by the consumer and environmental groups a fantasy. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions from hydrocarbons through carbon capture and other technology achieves better results than alternative energies, he said. Peak oil is unlikely for some time to come, he said. And Matt, this has kind of been his tone over the last few years. And I agree. This timetable that we have on the table right now, we just don't have a clear path to get from here to there without causing some major poverty issues and the ability to access power inexpensively.
You're absolutely right. I think that is a key thing we need to be talking more about, the fact that the ability for humans to flourish is dependent on access to reliable, affordable energy. And if we're just going to flip a switch, then what we're going to have to do is make compromises in terms of that affordability and reliability. If it means that we're going to be switching over to wind and solar, we don't have a way to back up the power when the wind is not blowing or when the sun isn't shining. So what it means is people are going to be without energy, and it's going to be a lot more expensive because you have to build out the extra infrastructure to take into account the fact that the wind is only blowing half the time or the sun is only shining during the day. And, so credit to him for telling the truth about this stuff and whether or not carbon capture and those types of things are actually going to end up being more beneficial for the climate. I tend to agree with that. I would need to do more research to really get into the numbers, but at least the research I've done so far, for example, EVs, you need to have an EV on the road for something like 20 years before it breaks even and then actually is more beneficial to the environment going forward than a combustion engine driven car. And that's because all of the energy and all of the carbon emissions that go into the mining of all the critical minerals and the cobalt and the lithium and the copper, and then the manufacturing, the steel that goes into it and all the things. So that by the time that car rolls off the assembly line, there's a certain amount of a carbon footprint that it has. Now, even if you charged it with solar panels and wind turbines that you had access to and didn't plug it into the grid, which is majority fossil fuel driven anyway, those are the types of conversations we need to be having. And to the extent that we need to continue to burn fossil fuels, capturing the carbon and sequestering it or reinjecting it to increase oil recovery and things like that, to me, make a lot more sense than forcing everybody to have to buy an EV. Well, ultimately, you're not going to be cutting emissions completely at that point. You're just trading one for the other, right? You're basically eliminating from one area where you're maybe burning fossil fuels, and maybe it's helping the local environment where you're driving the EV because there's no tailpipe emissions. But ultimately in sub-Saharan Africa where they're mining this stuff, it's even worse for those people because you've increased the emissions there from all the mining infrastructure, right? So these are the types of discussions we need to have about energy poverty, about what's best for the environment, instead of making these trade-offs that are really just benefiting the developed world and hurting the undeveloped world. So
you said it, Matt. And there was something in this article that I really thought was interesting, the way that they phrased this. And it says, big oil comes to the conference buoyed by several factors: a relatively strong and stable crude price supporting near record earnings, easing pressure from the ESG activism, and no immediate sign of peak oil demand, despite speculation during the pandemic that it may have been imminent. And so, Matt, I think that's really interesting because it kind of gives a glimpse to, okay, if we go down this road of transition, we're looking at a pandemic level of activity in needing those fossil fuels. And that just doesn't seem feasible. I mean, that was a complete pause to humanity at that point.
Yeah, that's a good point. In order to meet those timetables, that's what you'd have to do. And that's the fear, right? Is that in order to meet those artificial targets, that they're going to start enacting like a social credit score or a carbon credit score, like what China does. They have social credit scores. And if your social credit score is too low, sorry, Charlie, you can't go into this restricted area. You have to scan your pass or whatever. And so that's the real worry, that you have the draconian measures that are going to be taken that says, well, I'm sorry, you have a fossil fuel burning vehicle. You're not allowed to drive on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and we're going to fine you if you do. And those are the types of things that aren't really productive to solving the greater problem of needing all of humanity, not just the developed world, have access to affordable and reliable energy, and having conversations around how to get there in a way that doesn't require extreme sacrifices and require draconian measures by the government. I think those are the types of conversations we need to be having. And unfortunately, it's just a political us versus them, whether you're on the, quote unquote climate denier side of things or the extreme left of the climate extremists. And, we're all going to die tomorrow if we don't stop burning fossil fuels today. So fortunately, that's where it kind of boils down to. But I think with CERAWeek, to the extent that some of the conversations were actually happening behind closed doors, because all of the leaders in all these different fields across all forms of energy were there. And so hopefully there were some meaningful conversations that occurred that will move the needle in the right direction, and based on physics and based on logic and ways that we can actually get there that isn't going to cause massive human suffering. So
You said it, man. And the final note on that, it's great to see that the industry leaders are in a room all talking about this together, because that's exactly what we want. We really don't want the political landscape to be completely dictating this. These are the guys who can figure this out and push us forward.
Yeah, that's a great point. So you want to go ahead and talk about the last story?
Yep, absolutely. So New Mexico halts some oil-filled lease sales in a standoff over royalty rates in the Permian Basin. The article goes on to say New Mexico's state land office will withhold lease sales indefinitely on its most promising tracts for oil and natural gas development in the Permian Basin as it seeks approval by the state legislature to increase top-tier royalty rates, Land Commissioner Stephanie Garcia Richards said Thursday. Bills have been repeatedly stalled in the Democratic-led legislature, including this year, that would raise New Mexico's top royalty rate for oil and gas development from 20 to 25%. And Matt, this seems like a pretty logical thing that New Mexico is doing. This would help them a lot to fund their schools, to fund their road projects, and to just reap more benefit from the production that's going on. And there's already production here, so it's not like this is a brand new thing to the area.
Yeah, that's a great point. And according to the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, oil and gas contributed $13.9 billion to the New Mexico budget in 2023, which I believe was about 1/3 of the state's budget. So, it just goes to show how impactful this is. And so they're sitting down and trying to ensure that they're going to take advantage of the opportunity, because ultimately a lot of this land is going to get developed now, and then it may not get developed again in the future. And if there's no deeper formations or no other technology that's discovered that will increase production. So kudos to them for taking a look at it and doing right for their citizens. And to the extent that the going royalty rate in the area is 25% for fee minerals, so in other words, for privately owned mineral rights, certainly operators are used to paying that. And I've seen several cases where that is the case, and several projects that I've done for clients in Eddy County and Lee County, where there's a ton of activity. And frankly, the economics are there to support a 25% royalty. Operators can still drill and make plenty of money. So obviously the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association is going to lobby on behalf of its constituents, which are the oil and gas operators in New Mexico. But actually, I am siding here with this as well, Justin. I think it does make sense, and I think it's probably the right thing to do. And operators can still drill economic wells at a 25% royalty. And I think one of the arguments that was made for raising the rates was that across the border in Texas, the state land board over there has a 25% royalty on those top tier acres. So I think that's reasonable in this situation as well.
You said it, Matt. Yep. And let's hope that the legislation doesn't really use it as a way to feel like they're preventing development, because it's something that really just needs to get handled so that everything can move forward as business as usual.
Yep. No, I agree. And so let's move on to the rig count. So Justin, it's dropping, and not a big surprise. And in fact, I was actually expecting this type of drop here for a while. So we lost 4 land rigs over the past week. It's down to 601 from 605 the week prior, and this is as of March 22nd, 2024. And again, this is primarily gas plays that are dropping rigs. So Louisiana, specifically the Haynesville Shale, and then also in Pennsylvania and the Marcellus is really the majority of these rigs that we're losing. So we lost 4 in Haynesville, lost 1 in the Marcellus, in fact, lost 1 in the Permian as well. So we added a couple in other areas that are sort of outside of the major shale basins. Alaska added 1, so that's how the math adds up. But yeah, interesting to see this finally, and I think we're going to see more of this, certainly as gas is below $2. It's going to continue to be the case as operators like EQT and others have indicated that they're actually going to curtail production. So not only slow the drilling of new wells, but actually shut in wells because the price of gas is below their break-even cost to operate those wells. So, certainly that is going to help the price. And when I think EQT announced that, the price responded pretty well. It went up about 15 or 20 cents during that time period when they made that announcement. And I think more operators are going to follow suit, and that'll be what's necessary to bring supply and demand back in balance.
You said it, Matt. And we've talked about before in news stories and others that those LNG export is really the solution here to be able to move this natural gas and export it to other countries. And there's just been some political rattling, whether that's going to come to fruition or not in the near future. So it makes sense why operators are kind of adjusting and, they don't want to carry this loss if there's no light at the end of the tunnel, especially.
Yeah, they got to do what's right and make sure that they're not going to be losing money. And certainly that means not drilling any new wells until the price recovers. Because with these shale wells, as most of you know, that once you drill the well, you get the majority of the production in the first 6 months. And so if the prices are depressed during that first 6 months, you're really hurting the economics of that well, and you may end up not making the money back. And so these operators really have to do this in order to protect that investment. And what you may see, though, to the extent that they are still wanting to spend capital and then to be able to respond when the gas prices do recover, is they may drill wells but then not complete them. So you'll end up with what's called a DUC, a drilled uncompleted well. And so I expect the DUC count in these gas plays to increase as long as the gas price is below the break-even point. And then once the prices do recover, like you said, Justin, I think that the consensus is that once these new LNG export terminals that are being built right now are commissioned later in 2025, that demand will go up significantly, and that'll help restore prices if it doesn't happen before then. And so I think you'll see that DUC count increase until those prices recover, and then at which point they'll start to get back into business as usual, where they're drilling and completing at a more normal pace. But yeah, don't be surprised if you see a rig showing up and or permits on your minerals, and you're in a gas area like in Louisiana and the Haynesville, in the Pennsylvania and the Marcellus, where you may see that well drilled, but it may be a while before you start to see any royalty payments because they may wait some time, a year or two to complete those wells.
Absolutely, Matt. And DUCs are great for mineral owners. I mean, it's good to see that they've got those drilled uncompleted wells, and it helps the property value. So truly those drilled uncompleted wells is a blessing to have on your property. And as you said, Matt, hopefully we'll see the production come online from those eventually.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, that wraps up this month's news. And again, if you come across an article that you'd like us to cover, you can send an email to feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com. And as always, you can find the links to these articles in the show notes at mineralrightspodcast.com. So thanks again for listening. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.